Hello and welcome to the MoneyMagpie Invest podcast. I'm Jasmine Birtles, founder of MoneyMagpie.com. And before I do anything, I must say to you that you need to like, share and comment on this video and on this audio because you know you want to. Particularly comment because we're very interested in your thoughts and we do always reply. So do all of that. Oh, and nothing that's said in this podcast should be taken as financial advice. It's boring to say it, but it's important to know. So I've got all of that out of the way. Now I will introduce you to my guest, which is the lovely, the marvellous Helen Thomas, who is founder of Blonde Money, a macroeconomic consultancy. And she did also used to be special advisor to George Osborne when he was Shadow Chancellor. So, hey, she's got all sorts of thoughts, political and financial. Hello, Helen.
Hello, thank you for having me. It's good to see you, Jasmine.
Great. So, Helen, my first question, of course, is what do you think of Rachel Reeves's spending review and the potential for higher taxation coming later in the year?
Can I first say that the fact we're even talking about something like a spending review is interesting in itself? I mean, spending reviews were really a bit of a matter for Whitehall to fuss about because they were ad hoc every 1 to 4 years. They come after a budget. So the budget sets the big taxing and spending decisions, and then it's how you're going to slice and dice it. And I think that there's been so much focus on this one because of just the constant struggles that are bedeviling this government, where, as we know, they're in a very vulnerable fiscal position.
And is that vulnerable fiscal position something that they inherited from the Tories, or is it their fault, or is it a mix, would you say?
I do think it is a mix. I mean, look, the real elephant in the room that everyone should talk about is how did we get to this huge pile of debt, 100% of debt to GDP we have as a country now? Well, we did this huge stimulus in response to the pandemic. Now, that had to happen to some degree. Of course, it was a huge both health crisis and an economic crisis. So, that's why the debt piled up. We then had the war in Ukraine, which contributed to higher interest rates and higher inflation, which, when you've got a lot of debt, just makes matters a bit worse. Um, but some of the decisions taken right at the beginning by the Labour government, I think, have contributed to a difficult position, made it more vulnerable, which is why we keep coming back to Rachel Reeves. And can I say, I think the key one, really, we know they're going about growth, sensible to talk about growth. People listening might have their own views on how you get growth. But look, by putting that tax raise for national insurance contributions on the employer, you're taxing jobs, and that is no way around that. Tricky for the growth outlook, and that was a pure political decision that obviously the government made.
Yeah, it few things to pick up on there. I mean, my view, if I'm honest, is that we should never have had lockdown, and we should never have gone into for the Ukraine war. So if I ruled the world, we wouldn't have had either of those problems, but we might have had other problems as well.
Well,
So hey.
Jasmine, no, you're right to talk about all of this because it sometimes seems that we're just people say, "Oh, it was a cost of living crisis," like it was something imposed upon us. But, there were decisions that, like anyone, like if you run your life and you run your debt up very high and something comes along and throws you off course, in a way, it's just the position you got yourselves in. I mean, I've got to say, with the Ukraine war, I kind of was a bit surprised from a political perspective that the government at the time, and it was a Conservative government, um, didn't say, look, we're all paying. If we want to be in this, if we want to support Ukraine, the cost is that your shopping is more expensive. That's the front line, if you like. And it's sort of a bit odd that I don't think that ever really came across.
Yeah, it's a good point because I mean, personally, I would like to have more referenda. I mean, I know, a lot of people wouldn't, but I would like the voters to vote more on specific large events like lockdown, like the Ukraine war, all these big things. I think we, the people, need to have a say. Do you think that might come along? Because there seems to me, I don't know if you're feeling this, but there seems to me to be an increasing lack of trust in the authorities, and particularly in the government, it almost doesn't matter what government we have. I mean, this one particularly is very, very unpopular, and many people distrust it. But it does seem to be generally the case that governments are not trusted. So if we had more referenda, if voters had more of a say on specific issues, maybe that would help.
I think you need to move to Switzerland. I think they do loads of referenda, don't they,
Hmm.
Jasmine?
They do.
Well, it's on that one point about referenda. That's the interesting point is always where's your threshold, and if it is 50-50, and then inevitably there will be a group of people that feel it wasn't in their interest. And it's one of these really difficult points about, what is a democracy? I think, they say that democracy is, one of the worst forms of government apart from all the rest. It's tricky. But you've tapped into something really significant that is happening across the Western world, which is voters saying, are you doing this in my name? Why are you doing this? And the key word that everyone needs to think about at the moment is mandate. You've got to give your government a mandate. Now, it depends a bit in which country you're in and how the political system works, how your vote counts. If it's proportional representation, maybe you might get a coalition, or is it more like here in the UK and in the US, where winner takes all? Because what happens then is that you've got to put together the mandate to govern. And where the Labour Party is struggling at the moment is that their voters are saying, oh, I didn't vote for you to take winter fuel away from pensioners, or I didn't vote for disability reforms. And of course, those things were not in its manifesto. So you need the manifesto. And in fact, this is slightly where Liz Truss went wrong. She may have had good ideas, and people can discuss that. And we know it was a very volatile time. But she didn't have the mandate because she hadn't gone to the public. She could have called an election and said, this is my platform. She could have won a big majority. Then it would have all made perfect sense because the voters would have said, well, that's what I wanted. I wanted the tax cuts and spending cuts. But it didn't happen. Conversely, in America, President Trump has got a mandate. Now, some people are very unhappy about it, but that gives him the power to go forward and do some quite radical things. So I think you really have tapped into an important point there about how it works.
Well, that's very interesting because I think you and I have spoken about this before. It feels to me, and I think it feels to you, like there's a breaking up within the Labour Party. It certainly doesn't feel to me like the Labour Party has the mandate of the people, including, as you say, the people who actually voted for them. And many people say, "Oh, we've got another 4 years of them," but I'm not sure that we do. What do you think?
I think you're right to pick up on that. That has, I think it's more likely than not that this parliament won't last the full 4 years. It is, I think, very unusual for governing party to win a huge landslide majority and then collapse in the polls within a year, within its first year. Astonishing. And in third place, I saw in one of the latest polls, that was, I think, yeah, Reform Conservatives Labour. Now, remember, under Liz Truss, I think the Conservatives went down to about 18 or 19% in the polls. I mean, Labour at 20, 21%. This is really dangerous territory for any government, even though you might say, okay, but they've got this big majority. And what we're looking at, and the work we do in my business, is trying to quantify a lot of this risk. We have gone and analysed every single Labour MP for their what we call a Starmer rating to see if when a big vote comes through, can the government get it through? The big one coming up is on these welfare and disability benefit reforms. As it stands on our analysis, the government will lose that vote. We can see around 93 rebels, which would, if they all voted against, would mean the government would lose that vote, despite this massive majority. And it's kind of all come about because again, yeah, this not just that policy is not maybe what Labour voters wanted. It's probably not what the MPs themselves came into politics for. So I think that the drama in UK politics is coming back.
I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, to be honest. I mean, you think drama in politics, oh, not a good thing, but actually, get your popcorn out. It's can be quite
Well,
fun. Let's be
I
honest.
tell you what I see sometimes with this. So sometimes the way that political risk works is it's you sort of you have to swing dramatically in one direction to sort of swing back. I call it the Superman effect, whereby think of Clark Kent and Superman. Clark Kent would never get elected. He's the boring guy, just does his job. Superman swoops in and solves the crisis and rescues the damsel from a burning building. So you sort of have to almost have the burning building, I'm afraid, before politicians step up. And that's, yeah. So I think the closer we get to more volatility, actually, closer we get to resolution.
That'll be very interesting. And I mean, part of that volatility, as you've pointed out, is the amount of taxation that's already been imposed on
Mm.
people. And there is now a worry, as Mel Stride said, we've got a worrying summer where people are thinking, what extra taxes are going to be imposed on us to pay for the spending review? So what's your view on that, the taxation, and is it going to work?
I should jump in, by the way. I always say this, Jasmine, that, you can obviously, I mean, my personal political view doesn't matter in terms of what's going to happen in financial markets. And I think what is key about this government and the market is they're stuck in a bit of a doom loop, possibly, really, which is where the gilt market has already had some wobbles. It's charging higher levels of interest on the gilts in the longer term, higher even than there was under the Liz Truss government. Um, and what that means in the pure calculations of it is if that number gets higher, if we have to pay more interest on our debt, it's less money for other things. And so if you want to balance the books, you've got to get it from somewhere else. And of course, as you've just suggested, more tax hikes. But that then I say it's a loop because, tax hikes can be very detrimental to growth. You can't, there's just big discussions about, wealth taxes. But then if you drive people out of the country or the wealth leaves, then you just make the calculation even more difficult. So I think we're up at this 100% debt to GDP. There are higher interest rates out there, very vulnerable position. The government's decided to run with a very, very fine bit of headroom that, frankly, is probably already gone. So, what that means is every time you get any mention of taxation or spending policy like we're having now, markets move every day. So, we don't have to wait till October. The market is going to act on what do we see happening. And at some point, the market and the economists and purely apolitical, reasonable, calculating people will say the numbers don't add up and you can't get them to add up. And then that's a problem.
Well, it is, and I mean, you mentioned gilts. I'm personally very concerned about gilts. I'm also concerned about pension funds investing in gilts. Me personally, I don't touch them because I'm seeing a huge bubble, and I've had a few other guests that have talked about the potential bond market bubble. What do you feel about the gilt market? Do you feel that it's all right? Some of the gilts, so maybe short dated ones, are all right to invest in, or would you keep away from them totally as well?
I would keep away from them unless you have to be somehow invested due to a mandate or you're trying to match an asset and a liability or something like that. Um, because, as I say, it's like the market and the government are locked in a situation where they can't please each other. So the only resolution to that is kind of a blow up, if you like a couple that can't cope. You have to get it all out in the open. So and look, it's been a problem for the last few years because of what we discussed at the beginning, because of policy choices about this big amount of debt and the struggle to get growth. So I think there are if you have to hold any kind of debt, there are other places to go. But I think more and more, particularly in a higher inflation, higher interest rate world, which is very much the world we're now in, very different to the previous 15 years that we've been through. You probably want to look at what they call hard assets, like housing or gold, even, or things like that, as maybe part of the portfolio. Because even cash, and while I think cash buffer is useful during these more volatile times, and the volatility will continue. Of course, the inflation erodes that, so you do have to put your money somewhere, and there'll always be somewhere in the world where there's an opportunity. I am an optimist.
Yes, me too. And I mean, as you say, gold is something I've been banging on about. Property, yeah, I'm sort of like half and half because,
Yeah.
oh, gosh, it's such a nuisance, isn't it? But as
Well,
you
yeah, and
say,
of course there are rules. I mean, they're difficult to own second or third homes in the UK, and landlord rules and all these changes in the UK. It's tricky, I admit.
absolutely. But then as you say, that the cash issue again. I was just talking to somebody today about this. That there are apparently a lot of people taking money out of investments, putting them either into cash, into savings accounts, or into their bank account to pay the extra costs that they've got. But the concern about having more and more people putting money into savings accounts is that from day one you're losing value. I mean, you just are losing value with cash. Do you see any possibility of interest rates going up? Not that that's going to help massively, because as I say, the fiat currency is losing its value just in and of itself. But it seems to me that interest rates are not going to come down, but might they even go up, do you think?
Well, as I say, I think of it more broadly just as a higher interest rate, higher inflation world. And we're not really in a normal business cycle. We haven't been since 2020, despite what people say. The whole world shut down, reopened. The pieces of that puzzle are still falling back to place. That's 5 years. This has gone on. It's only just starting to equilibrate. Um, but so I think you need cash for liquidity purposes, literally being able to get hold of cash if you need it, because I do think in the world that we're now in, with less of the quantitative easing that had gone on where central banks would buy assets, it's just for markets there's not as much liquidity sloshing around. But then you do also, as you've suggested, you don't want to be out of the market too much because, we all know on a 20-year basis, and we should have long time horizons, particularly with pension saving. You've got this compound interest. The more you have in, eventually the more you'll get out. So I sort of think of it like a bit of instead of thinking of portfolios as yeah, well, the classic is this 60-40, equities and bonds. I think you've got to think about it like a barbell, like a lump in cash and then a lump in something rather more risky, with the view that you're not touching the risky stuff. That stays. It's something that you believe a long term trend is there, but you've got the cash for volatile and illiquid moments.
And you were saying about the Labour Party probably not going for the full term.
Mm.
So I mean, here we need to get our crystal balls out. And because you were mentioning that we need some sort of big bust up, which, to be honest, is what I'm thinking. Not just politically, but financially. It seems to me that whichever party we have in, not just here, but in France, in America, in Germany, in Spain, whatever, whoever is in power, they are not going to be able to make the cuts that they're going to have to make. We all need to make these cuts, but they're not going to be able to do it because the voters won't allow them until we get some sort of major financial bust up where whoever's in power can go, look, literally, there's nothing. We have no, there is no money. There's
Yeah.
no money. You can complain as much. There isn't any. What do you think so?
Well, look at Greece after obviously the sovereign debt crisis. I mean, that a lot had a huge political fragmentation. A whole new party came along. A new politician emerged. Alexis Tsipras became the prime minister. And then Greece actually, sort of took its medicine eventually, and now Greece has a surplus on its budget surplus. So um, but it went through, a great deal of turmoil, including protests, people out on the streets. What we're getting is a fracturing of politics where um, everybody's looking for the answer from somebody, whether it's to the left or to the right, whether it's what you might call authoritarian or libertarian. And it's just, throwing voters, fragmenting them completely. So they always say in politics, try and please as many people most of the time. Well, at the moment, you're not going to please anyone any of the time. It's almost a given. So yeah, so when I think about how that breaks down, particularly in the UK, now people should remember that Labour MPs have defected from the party before. There was a big row over Brexit. We had this thing called the TIG group, which was actually Labour and Conservative MPs, but Chuka Umunna was a big MP at the time in the Labour Party, big Remain pro EU person, and they splintered off. That's what they believed in. They thought they'd have the political support from the country, and they didn't. But it happens, even in a country like ours, where historically it has been sort of a two and a half party system. I mean, look at the dramatic rise of Reform. I mean, think about a world where Reform are polling it between 35 to 40% consistently. Labour and Conservatives just under 20, and the government has had to conduct some kind of austerity because the market has forced it upon them. I think in that world, it starts to become almost untenable for a government to operate. And as I say, some of the own MPs within the Labour Party could well defect. I mean, they could defect to Reform. I should point out to you, by the way, that in Spain, the current Prime Minister, who's going through a lot of trouble, actually is getting mired in corruption scandals, and there's people out protesting in Madrid saying, let's have an election. But Pedro Sanchez, when he came to power, he only had 85 MPs. He was vastly in the minority, and it was because the Rajoy government at the time, this is a while back now, were really just totally discredited, and had just terrible corruption had happened. So people should think of this mandate again. What does the public want? You can't go on forever with 75% of the population against what you're doing. You've got to get buy-in, and that pressure is what I think will lead to an early election.
Yes, that's an interesting one because, as you say, they have to have the mandate. Right now, they don't have the mandate, but they're still clinging on, perhaps because we're not saying anything. There aren't enough people on the streets with placards. There aren't enough people in the media going, get out, get out, get out. We have to get to that stage, I assume.
Uh, yes, or the yeah, it could come in it's quite interesting in the current world, of course, with the role of social media. Obviously, people on the streets is always a very, very visceral way of doing this, but we do live a very online life now, and you could imagine a groundswell of comment online saying, there has to be an election, these people have to go, or I mean, I'm sure it would start with get rid of Starmer, we need a different prime minister, which, by the way, is much harder for the Labour Party than it is for the Conservative Party, just process wise. And even then, it would be interesting to know, or I think it's quite clear that with a fractured electorate, simply changing the person at the top isn't going to do the job. It has to be this mandate. It has to be right, as you say, some sort of crisis, something to push the agenda. Okay, it's not working. We stand on this platform. Are you with us? And actually, back to sort of post 2008-9, George Osborne and David Cameron, had to go into coalition, but they came in and they were able to enact austerity package because they said we've got to get the house in order, and then they were able to do it.
Actually, good point about austerity. Do you think it worked? Because there are a lot of people, obviously, mostly on the left, who say austerity was a terrible thing. We're still coping with the fallout from that. It should never have happened. Do you think that it was a good policy, and did it do at least partly what it was supposed to do?
I think it did do what it was supposed to do, which the primary aim, people forget now in 2009, that the bond market, our friend the bond market, was really, again, very much in trouble because it was actually a worse situation than now because we had deflation. And when you have a lot of debt and deflation, that's even worse because the debt kind of ends up dragging and costing more and more. And people may probably not remember this, but Bill Gross, big bond investor, the bond king as he was back then, he said gilts are sitting on a bed of nitroglycerin. The whole thing could have just gone kaput. And so it really was felt. And let me make that clear what that means. This isn't just I mean, it was obviously quite significant what happened around that Liz Truss budget. But when you get to the point where you lose market confidence in your ability to pay your own way as a government, you will be penalised for generations, is what happens to emerging market economies, happened somewhat here in the UK after the IMF in the 1970s. So I do understand that argument. I can see the argument against austerity and where people are coming from in terms of they want better public services, and there's an argument about how to deliver better public services. But getting a grip on the finances had to be done. Particularly, I remember we put banks on our balance sheet that we've only just now got rid of as a nation with RBS. Think how long that took. So we talk about higher interest rates. It could be a lot worse now if that hadn't happened.
Well, absolutely. And finally, speaking of higher interest rates, I was talking to somebody the other day who is sort of a bond manager, bond analyst, and she was saying, "Oh, yeah, the bond market's perfectly fine." And I said, "But the interest rates are higher than the height of the Liz Truss problem. What don't you have a?" She said, "No, no, it's fine because it's all happening gradually. It's the volatility that's the problem." Do you think the same, or are you concerned by these interest rates?
I think there is a rational repricing going on because the UK government is not managing to really deliver growth. I know there were good Q1 numbers. We'll see if they persist to Q2 because there was front loading ahead of the Trump tariffs, etc. But either way, these are not big growth numbers. So look, you would then say, okay, well, look, we're going to have to charge you a bit more for your debt, UK, because we're not sure that this is credible, this plan. Um, but you don't need to have a quick move for it to get difficult. You could just have it slowly get worse and worse. That's point one. Point two is this idea of like the doom loop, which is at the moment the gilt market is expecting in August that the government will just do whatever they have to do to make the fiscal rule add up, even if it were austerity. But if you're already now seeing a significant rebellion on this welfare package from the government with its big majority, eh, the market is going to have to realise that the political constraint is much more binding than they had been led to believe.
Interesting times, don't you think?
Oh,
Very
no,
interesting times, and even more interesting to go forward in 2025.
certainly is. I hope everyone's not
Thank
too
you.
depressed, Jasmine, but we have to tell it how it is, don't we?
Well, we do. I mean, this is the thing, particularly for investors. Forewarned is forearmed, and so I think it's really helpful to think through these potential risks. I mean, this is what your job is, to look at the risks in the market and see how they're going to affect investors. Helen Thomas from Blonde Money, thank you so much for your really, really useful insights there. That, as I say, was Helen Thomas, founder of Blonde Money and former advisor, special advisor to George Osborne when he was Shadow Chancellor. I'm Jasmine Birtles from Money Magpie. This has been the Money Magpie Invest podcast. Like, share, tell all your friends, and comment. We're always very interested in that, of course. And see you next week.